This story takes place in 2008. I was 7 years old and I lived in Beaverton, Oregon. It's a pretty nice wooded area, where constantly rainy weather that boasts a population of nearly 100,000 people. While it's a nice place to live and all, the crime rates were pretty high. Almost every couple of nights an apartment next to us will get burglarized. Local stores also were held up quite a bit. I went to a nearby school that wasn't funded very well either. As in, the play equipment was worn down and the building itself was falling apart. The kids that went there were mostly kids that came from lower income families. The school was built right next to a large wooded area. The woods probably covered a 4 acre of land. Now, as a second grader, I absolutely loved to sneak off during recess when the teachers weren't working and go explore this wooded area with my friends. I had 3 friends named Parker, Aaron, and Brian. They would almost always accompany me on these quick 15-minute adventures through the woods. The cool thing was that I and those 3 friends lived really close to one another. And we also lived only a block away from the school. So we found ourselves almost every day hanging out after school in this wooded area. We would usually bring out a bunch of snacks, find a comfortable place to sit and play Mario Party DS until the sun started going down. On the last day of second grade, I and my friends decided we were going to walk through the entire wooded area until we reached the other side. None of us had ever made it to the other side before. Usually, we would stop 10 minutes in. Keep in mind the trees in this area were absolutely huge. When the bell rang and the school was out of session for the summer, the 4 of us ran home pretty quickly and alerted the parents of our plans. Then we made our way where we usually met at the entrance of the wooded area. The walk was super uneventful. We found ourselves bored and rather unsettled by the silent nature of the woods. I should mention that to the right of the woods, there was a large road that went straight for miles. If you were able to drive down there, it led to a very sketchy neighborhood that was notorious for its high crime rates. Quite a bit of Amber Alerts were issued in that part of town as well. Our parents all told us to avoid this part of time, not to go any further than the end of the woods. Anyway, back to the story. We made it to the end of the woods eventually, after several Mario Party sessions, of course, and instead of being happy about it, we were actually quite creeped out. The sun was setting a little earlier than we thought it would. And it would take another 40 minutes to make it to where we had started this journey. We decided we'd walk along the road I mentioned earlier as it was getting pretty dark. Walking through an uncapped wooded area at this time of night would eventually end up in bad stuff and would definitely be really unsettling. Panic started to set in when 20 minutes later Aaron's phone, which I believe was a Motorola Razr. This is important because he was the only kid in our group that had a phone had died and the Senate almost set entirely. It looked like it was 9 o'clock, but it was only probably around 7. My parents had told me to be back by 6:30 as well. And with me having anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes until I was home. I was a bit anxious about my parents and how they would react to me being late. I was also nervous because I had never been in this area when it was dark. We usually made it home right when the sun started to set. So it was always at least somewhat light outside. But it was nearly pitch black out, and I knew for sure my mom and dad were worried about my whereabouts the entire walk, not a single car driven by us. However, about 10 minutes from the school, very beat up looking Ford Escort slowly drives ahead of us. It was too dark to see anybody inside. It drives ahead of us about 20 feet before them slowing down and pulling to the side. Right when this happened, the 4 of us stopped in our tracks and watched our now fully stocked car anxiously. My gut instinct at this point was telling me that something was very wrong with this picture. A man then got out of the car of the passenger side, and then started talking to somebody that was in the driver's seat before looking at the 4 of us, every couple of seconds. We were frozen and hadn't said a single word as the car poured in front of us. The man on the passenger side of the car was a burly tall man and probably 6'4" and 250 pounds. A couple of seconds later, we saw the man reach into the car and pull something out before he then started running as fast as he could. We all screamed louder than we probably ever have in our lives, and ran immediately into the neighboring woods, sticking together the entire time. As we ambushed our way into the woods, we heard a man screaming angrily, before then hearing the car from earlier slam on the gas and then fade out into the distance. We hauled ass home at that point and told our parents about the incident. The local police department was alerted about the situation. However, nobody was ever caught. And nothing came from the situation afterwards. My parents became pretty strict after that night and didn't let me walk around outside without parental supervision until I was probably 11 or 12. Regardless of their decision to not let me wander around outside alone, I wouldn't have gone back to that wooded area anyway. In fact, after that night, I and my friends played video games at the house. And so we moved in 2012. Thinking about this incident today is pretty scary to think about what could have happened had we not quickly made our way into the woods to hide. The man chasing us could have easily picked all four of us up at once and could have just as easily stuffed up as in his car. Let the story be a warning to parents who don't think their kids are in harm's way when they're playing outside alone. So this was around, I say, when I was 11 or 12. I know it was before I was 13 because my grandmother wasn't sick, and I didn't move from my state. This was in North Dakota on my reservation called Standing Rock. It was the beginning of October, and as always I went out hunting. It was my passion, and I always enjoyed it every time I went out. One day, I went with my grandfather to hunt some squirrels and an oakwood patch that was next to the cornfield that was in a small ravine that leads to the Missouri River. We got a couple of pheasants and some bush since we had tags for them. For being a drive member, I got my tags for really cheap. So we got all the tags we could get. When we got to the oakwood patch, me and my grandfather got out of the truck and went down. There was a path that led into the oak patch that cattle used. So it was easy for us to get down into it. My grandfather went deeper, past a natural spring that was at the beginning of an oakwood patch of trees. We shot a couple of squirrels, but my grandfather's knees got the better of them. About halfway through the patch of trees, it was bigger than we both thought since we have never been in there before. We've been out everywhere in the country where my grandparents lived. He then said to me, "I'm going to head back to the truck. My knees are hurting too much." I looked at him and said, "Okay, can I go a little further?" He said it was fine to come back to the truck soon. So we went back to the truck and I headed further down into the ravine. I shot a few more squirrel and I felt that I had enough. My curiosity was getting the better of me though, and I decided to head a little bit further. Since I had never been to this place before, I walked for about 10 more minutes until I saw a huge oak tree. This thing was very huge, the biggest I've ever seen in my life. It was at least 12 feet in diameter and probably like 130 feet tall. I sat there and stared at it in amazement for a few moments. But when I saw two pathways with the oak tree dividing them, one on my left to the river since I could hear the water that led into the woods. This ravine wasn't one I've seen before. I thought it would have an end by this point. I had to the left of the path to see the river and possibly find a new fishing spot. But as soon as I got to the oak tree literally across from me, if I extended my arm out, it would be facing directly at its side. It felt this thing like it was in danger. And I felt the song comfortable feeling, which I rarely got when I was hunting. Since I've been hunting all my life since I was young. This voice inside my head kept saying softly, so softly said it twice, but I ignored it. I walked in past the oak tree and I jumped and staggered, almost falling onto my side as the voice yelled, "Don't go at me." And then I felt this feeling that I was in danger. I said to myself, something isn't right. So I started to head back to the truck. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Hairs on the back of my neck were standing up until I came up to this incline in the ravine. And I stopped when I saw this black little thing, looking at me at the base of a tree. It was like it was smiling me evilly. I stared at it and kept my 12-gauge shotgun at the ready. I walked slowly further away watching it. Then looking away at the corner of my eye, I saw this all-black, skinny thing hiding behind a tree. I was scared, but I stepped forward with my shotgun. I put my aim in it and kept on hiding behind the tree. It was picking us lightly. Like it was scared of me. This thing was all black, tall and skinny, with long arms and legs. I've never seen anything like this in my life. But for some reason, lyrics to the songs that were my favorite were singing in my head. Songs are the casting crowns such as Who Am I and Song for Mercy Me I Can Only Imagine. I was raised Christian, and I sing them out loud as I walked closer. I didn't feel that feeling of danger. I felt being watched though. As soon as I got to the beginning of the ravine, I saw the truck. I felt released. At last. I then looked behind me, and I didn't see anything. I walked back up to the truck and got in, and we laughed. I didn't tell my grandfather about it. When he asked how was it, I don't know why I didn't tell him or anyone else. Maybe because I thought they would probably think I'm crazy. But I just told him it was good. And we left. To this day, I don't know what it was. It puzzles me. I've actually had several paranormal encounters over the years, but this one has always struck me as particularly bizarre and frightening. This incident occurred sometime in the fall of 2006. I grew up in a rural part of Ohio. My house had fairly dense woods located directly behind it. As a child, I had a passion for exploring. I especially loved exploring those woods. It was my favorite place to be. Prior to the incident, I wandered through those woods many times, always with my mother's permission. There was one tree in particular that I frequently enjoy climbing, usually about the halfway mark, so I could push myself on one of the heavier branches and just relax as I listened to peaceful sounds of nature. Climbing that tree for the very first time was quite an accomplishment. From that position, I could partially see the back of my house. On that day, after a fair amount of exploring, I carefully scaled my favorite tree. I seated myself on a sturdy branch and took in the view. Naturally, being in October, the sun inevitably began to set within a few minutes. I always felt a little sad and to see the darkness approaching. The woods were like my own little sanctuary. I could entertain myself out there for hours. When darkness began to fall, however, my mother would stand at the edge of the woods and call my name until I obediently returned home, so not to be stranded out in the dark. After watching the sunset until I could no longer see it, I began my descent down the tree. I was nearly at the bottom when I heard my mother's familiar voice calling my name. I thought nothing of it at first, as this was routine and had occurred plenty of times before. Then I realized something strange as my feet touched the ground. My mother's voice was coming from behind me, deeper in the woods, rather than towards the entrance where she always stood when she called me home. My mom had never entered those words before, at least now with me. I was eager to find her and show her all of my favorite spots before dark. That's when I realized something was off. How could she have gone in the woods ahead of me? Certainly wouldn't have missed her. But as I said, she never entered those woods anyway. She continued calling my name, but there was something strange about it. She sounded absolutely frantic, almost angry, fearing that I was in trouble for reasons currently unknown. I froze in place as her voice drew closer. I squinted my eyes to see if I could locate her and determine how exactly angry she was. Or maybe I could gauge how upset she appeared to be. However, I didn't see anyone or anything unusual. Suddenly, I heard her voice calling my name from the direction of my house, sounding much calmer. Seconds later, from somewhere within the woods yet again, it wasn't an echo. I wasn't imagining things. I was literally hearing her backing me from the edge of our backyard as well as ahead of me. My legs suddenly turned to jelly. And I couldn't quite comprehend what was going on. "Come here, right now," the voice that originally believed to be her screamed to just ahead of me. I realized that whoever or whatever was mimicking my mother was drawn closer. I didn't question which voice was actually my mother's, as there was something about the way it sounded that unnerved me, terrified of what I would see if I stood there much longer. I turned around and ran towards the exit of the woods as quickly as my legs could possibly carry me. It was amazing that it didn't trip over anything in my haste. Even though my house wasn't very far away from there. Even though my house wasn't very far away from where I'd been standing, those words had never become larger to me. From behind me, my mother's voice continued to call my name, now sounding desperate. Panic set in as my actual mother finally came into view, waiting patiently as she usually did until I returned home. In my frightened state, I absolutely refused to look back. As soon as I was out of the woods and into the backyard next to my mother, the other voice was suddenly gone. Rather than fading away, it seemed to stop the very moment I stepped into my backyard. I must have looked as frightened as I felt, because my mother asked me what was wrong. Slowly, but surely, my panic subsided. I didn't say anything until we were safely inside of the house with our doors locked. I asked my mother if she had entered the woods, appearing confused by question. She told me that of course she hadn't. With that confirmation, I hesitantly asked her if she heard anyone else calling my name and yelling. The answer to that question was also no. Although I was still very much shaken up, I managed to explain everything that had happened as clearly and as rationally as possible. My mother was surprisingly nonchalant about the whole situation, explaining that I must have just imagined it, that I was spending too much time out there by myself. The incident in those woods has stayed with me till this day. I could still hear that voice as clear as a bell. Whoever or whatever was calling my name sounded exactly like my mother. But I know it was a her. Not only was she waiting for me outside, but the voice also sounded strange in a way that I still can't fully explain. I didn't go back into the woods until I was 17 years old, and even then, I never hung out for very long. I've carefully gone over every possible explanation, but none of them seem to be explainable. None of them seemed to make any sense. It certainly wasn't my mother playing a prank. There was no way she could afford it off. Not to mention the fact that she's never been one to play pranks. I also highly doubt that it was anyone else because, as I stated before, we lived in a rural area, the closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I wasn't personally acquainted with any of them. How could they have known where to find me and my name? We've since moved out of that house. But my mother and I can only discuss the incident. She still claims that she never heard or saw anything unusual out there. I know probably shouldn't matter. But what happened in those woods continues to bother me. I spent many hours out there prior to that. And I've never experienced anything out of the ordinary since, but I just can't explain this. If anybody has any possible explanation, please let me know. I'm English. I do loads of hiking on my own in the Lake District. I had a lot of work up there around this time, and it meant being away from my family. But I loved and embraced the solitude when I got the chance. I'm actually collecting the Wainwrights, which means getting to the top of our 214 peaks in Cumbria. I'm at about 140 at the moment. So really experienced and very careful to know when I'm on both GPS and paper maps. About 5 years ago, I was walking route around some of the bigger mountains. One of the peaks on this walk is called Great End. And the suggested route seemed too far away. So I thought I checked for other paths that were closer to where I was. I looked at the map and found that there was a path right next to me. So I looked and saw a slightly trod path heading up, not too steep. From where I was standing, there was a bit of ice and snow on the side, but nothing put me off. As I said, it wasn't steep. But after 30 seconds on this path, I all of a sudden started panicking. Normally, really level-headed. I couldn't work out what was wrong. But a nasty feeling came over me like an impending doom. I thought I needed to call this one off, as I really didn't feel right. I turned to head back down the path and couldn't believe it. I somehow managed to walk up a near vertical cliff, covered in snow. The only way down was to shuffle on my backside. And even when I could have slipped up somehow. Any wrong move could have killed me. I had been using my telescopic walking pore on the way up, but could not find it anywhere. Now, this is a busy part of the world. And it was a beautiful day. But there wasn't a soul to be seen. It took me about 20 minutes to shuffle down this icy slope and back onto the path. I looked back to where I come from. You can clearly see that this was not a path, but a really dangerous and craggy buttress, and could see the point where I decided to turn back. There is no way I could have gotten there without climbing. And absolutely no way could I have done in 30 seconds. I looked at the map again. And the path that I had spotted was a lot further around the base. It was really creepy. It still freaks me out to this day that I somehow lost all of that time. 5 to 10 minutes, maybe it somehow ended up in a place that I definitely wasn't before. Has anybody ever experienced this? And does anybody know what it could have been? This story happened about 2 years ago, and I still occasionally think about it. I live in the middle of Scotland. The winters are wet, cold, and immensely dark. One night, I was walking up to the shops at about 10 p.m. The path followed an area of interlocking rundown terraces encroaching forests whose branches reached out across the path and several fields. With it being winter, the grass came up to your thigh. This journey in total usually takes about 30 minutes at least. On the right side of the latter area of the path is a series of mansions, about 5 or 6 of them all along this stretch. Most of the occupants would have been away for the winter, but one mansion was well lit. This mansion was just like the others, a passive state building which was well kept as they usually are. Apart from the specifically placed for. It was a completely normal mansion. All the lights in the house were turned on. And in the windows, I saw the shadows of dozens of people prancing around, dancing, having fun and drinking. Strange thing was though, I couldn't hear anything, no voices, laughter or music. Nothing at all. In all honesty, it looked like a fun party that I somehow felt I was allowed to go in with no problem. But I don't party with strangers, and I carried on to the shops and got what I needed. When I left the shops, it had started snowing. The clouds covered so much of the sky that not even the light of the moon shone through. The snow was barreling down so much that I could barely see. But I kept going back down the path towards home. I decided to have another look at the park or the mansion, just out of curiosity. To my surprise, all I saw was nothing. The previously lively and decadent and gorgeous match. It was now a decaying relic. Its sides crumbling, its window smashed, its roof caved in. The trimmed garden was now an overgrown jungle. Between me and walking back to my house had completely changed. I quickly walked home after seeing that. A year after that, me and a friend went to have a look at the house in the middle of a summer day. A wooden break into the house, and all of the doors were covered with metal locks. During one day, the house was kind of beautiful, like a little overgrown, isolated paradise, with many kinds of beautiful and colorful flowers darting around the area. All that we found was a shed, which inside was an abandoned workshop and a business card dated in 1996. I don't know what to think of that house. Did I imagine it was a squatter's? In Scotland, there are so many stories of fairies creating visual illusions to lure humans to their world, which could explain the lack of sound and honesty. I don't know. I still walk past that mansion. Whenever I go to the shops is being gated up now and entirely covered in locks. Whatever mystery can be answered by going into the mansion itself. I'm not going to go look. I am an avid hunter. I go every season and I love it. More often than not, I don't kill any game. But I just love getting out into the woods. I don't know if you're familiar with hunting season in Pennsylvania. But during late November, rifle season is in full swing. It was already the second week of the season. Now I had yet to bag any deer. So I was eager to get to it early in the morning. And I did. I normally get up at around 5 a.m. and drive to my hunting spot. It's private land that my grandfather owns him and I are the only to hunt on it. And the rest is posted to hunters, and the only others on that land are employed on my grandfather's farm. I had originally planned on calling my grandfather when I woke up and asked him if he wanted to tag along. But the weather was more than horrendous in the morning. The snow was pouring down and the wind was really strong. And I love hunting in the snow. But it almost made me decide not to go. So I knew he would want to the roads really bad. So it took me a bit longer to drive there. Normally, the sun would be starting to rise by now. However, it was overcast and snowing. Regardless of the snow, I walked up to my spot. It was directly behind my grandfather's house over a hill and back about 100 to 150 yards. Almost immediately upon sitting in my spot, I hear things moving all around me. Honestly, I didn't pay too much attention to it. It could have been a number of things. But it was still pitch black. And the thought of it was kind of creeping me out. But there wasn't much I could do. It's not like I can shoot at anything. So I just ignored it and continued to wait. It wasn't much longer after that I began hearing something walking just over the ridge to my right. At this point, there's barely enough light to see my feet. So even if it was a deer, there was still nothing I could do. However, I could tell it wasn't a deer. I just assume it was my grandfather walking to his spots, which is just a short walk from mine. But the lights in the house were off. And if he was up here, I'm sure he'd let me know prior. Even if it wasn't him. It was a hunter. Albeit hunting illegally. I still wanted to let him know I was here. So I turned on my flashlight and pointed into his direction, flashing it several times. Again, even if it was a deer, I couldn't shoot it. So I felt it was better to be safe rather than sorry. Nothing happened after that. After I flashed my light, then we stopped, which was really odd. I didn't see them turn back or hear them. So I figured they either sat down right there after seeing my lights, which was considered extremely rude, or B, I didn't hear them walk off. I just assumed it was the latter. An hour or so passes and finally the first signs of daylight start to shine through. It's still snowing, and the snow was falling in entire snowballs, rather than snowflakes. So visibility is pretty limited. Around this time, notice that an odd-looking lump protruding from a group of trees, the shrubs atop the hill that separates my granddad's house, right where I had movement earlier. It looked like a mound of dirt. However, it was sticking out from the side of a tree. So obviously it wasn't dirt. Naturally, I raised my rifle to take a closer look. I could tell immediately that I was looking at the side of an older-style camouflage coat. It took a minute, but it finally clicked. That was a person over there. I just thought it was a hunter. So I didn't know what to do about it. I knew if he was hunting on our land illegally, and from that I could see he wasn't wearing anything orange, which is required of all hunters during the rifle season. And I could tell just from looking, whoever this was, wasn't my grandfather. I sat there for a minute of meeting my next move. But I started to call my granddad at the risk of blowing his stunt if that was actually him over there. So without taking my eyes off this guy, put on my phone and dialed his number. To my dismay, he picked up and I told him what was going on. So he told me that he'd make his way up there. I started on my own to give this guy a whistle to let him know I see him, but he didn't react at all. After a few minutes, I started to walk up to this guy. After walking a short distance, I could clearly see this guy who was sound asleep tucked in between a shrub and a couple of trees. He obviously thought out here was a great place to lay down, as I would never be able to see him and his coat was not stuck out. And as I thought he had no orange on, I gave him another whistle much louder and he woke right up, almost immediately shuffling over to hide his exposed coat. He had a nasty, scruffy beard and a gray hat. Honestly, he looked like a homeless man, probably in his 50s. But he had a perfect view of my granddad's home from his spot. And I had a pretty good idea that he was planning to do once my granddad left the house was this guy realize he'd been caught, and he'd saw 6'5" Magi carrying a rifle. He started freaking out, his face went pale, and almost instantly, he tried to feed me some bullshit that he gotten lost during a drive with a group of other hunters. A drive as a coordinator pushed through a thicket in order to drive deer or two hunters sitting at the edge of a designated driving area. However, the closest public game plan is miles from the spy. So I knew it was a lie. He just wanted to keep on going on about how he was lost and how he fell asleep. He even went as far to make up a fake name on the spot. I just stood there and listened, making sure he didn't give me any fishy movements.